the online research. Why do we talk about online research specifically? Because right now, I think a very large number of studies, probably a majority of all studies in psychology, are conducted online. And it's not only survey studies, it is also experimental studies. Because it's very cheap, it's very easy, and sometimes if you are trying to collect data right before the deadline for submission of your master's thesis, a strategy that I don't recommend you to use. But if you find yourself in this situation, an online study is probably the only way you can collect your data very quickly. And it's very easy to collect a very large sample. Obviously, we can ask the question, can we really trust the findings of online research? And you can put the video on a pause and reflect for a moment. What are the reasons to trust or not to trust online research? And some typical objections to online research were proposed by people some 15 years ago when online samples were still somewhat exotic, and reviewers or people on the dissertation committees would say people on the internet are not normal people, they are some kind of computer programmers, or you don't know who is filling out your survey. Maybe it's an old guy pretending to be a small girl and answering on her behalf. Or how do you know that people are answering seriously? Maybe it's a bunch of friends at a party making fun of your questionnaire and kind of generating those answers together. Luckily, now we know that most of these objections are actually fears that people had, but they are not really realistic. Most online samples are even better than traditional paper-based samples. The only objection that might really be important is you can't really control the conditions. People might complete your questionnaire in the underground or at a lecture. Even right now when you're listening, you might be completing someone's questionnaire. So if you think that conditions might actually influence the outcome of your research, the only thing you can do is to ask people to please find a quiet place to complete your questionnaire where nothing is distracting them. But you cannot be always sure. Are internet samples representative? It depends. It depends mainly on the country. These are data from 2015 I found on the Wikipedia. I did not find any newer, nicer graph. But even here you can see that in developed countries, in the first world countries, and in Russia as well, the proportion of people who use the internet is fairly large. But in countries like Africa or even India and China, this proportion is substantially smaller. So if you are doing your research in those countries, you need to be very careful because people on the internet might indeed not be quite your average people. Luckily, this situation improves with every year. Even 10 years in Russia, dissertation committees were very suspicious about online samples. But nowadays, the proportion of internet users in Russia is so large that probably it's not a big issue. And this is the same for the world. As you can see, in the last 5 years, the proportion of people who use the internet has grown almost twice. So now it's 4.3 billion of Earth citizens who use internet somewhat regularly. I can't remember, I think it was once a month in that survey. But 4.3 out of 7 billion, including children, it's actually a lot. Sometimes your online studies may not be quite representative if you're interested in social groups who are unlikely to use the internet. People who are very advanced in age and they just don't know the technology, or people with very low education levels, or people with very low socioeconomic status, like disadvantaged groups like homeless. Obviously, they don't have computers and they don't have the resources to access the internet. So if your research question concerns such social groups, probably you need to approach online studies with a lot of caution. But in most cases, if your research question is just some kind of personality study, it's not a problem. And with underrepresented groups, you can deal by performing some weightings or analyzing in different subsamples. So if you are worried that your sample might not be representative, you can make some additional statistical analysis. If we compare online studies with classical paper-based studies, obviously paper-based studies are easy to create. You print your questionnaire and it's here, but the problem is that the cost is proportional to sample size. Each additional questionnaire requires additional effort, and you need to enter the data, and you need to screen the data for quality, because when we type answers into a computer, very often we make errors. That's why in online studies are much better. They are slightly harder to create initially, but the costs do not depend on sample size. Collecting 10 people and 1,000 people probably requires just the same amount of effort. And also in the online studies, you don't get data entry errors in case if your questionnaire is well designed. And one advantage that is not so obvious: when you do your study on paper, people still see you. Even if your study is fully anonymous, they still have this impression that someone is going to see their answers. As a result, perceived anonymity is lower and social desirability might be stronger. In online studies, you can make it fully anonymous, and when people are sitting in front of a computer, just like I'm sitting now, they assume that no one actually is going to see their answers. And as a result, they can be completely open to give you true, genuine responses. Some people thought that when people complete studies online, the answers might be random or the answers might be strange and bogus. But in fact, it's actually vice versa. If you are doing a study online and there is no feedback and there is no motivation to complete your study, then people have no reason to click through your study. Why should they do it? Whereas on paper, if you hand out your questionnaire to some people you see in front of you, maybe they feel a bit awkward to refuse, and they kind of take your questionnaire, but then they feel uncomfortable filling it out, and they might put some strange answers. Obviously, we need to ensure that they are all volunteers, but sometimes still you get this type of problem. Online, it's very easy to stop participation, just close the window. As a result, people who complete your questionnaire until the end, you can be sure that they are quite motivated and that they are really volunteers. And also, online, it's very easy to select your respondents flexibly. If you are interested in pregnant women using cocaine, it might be impossible to find them in real life anywhere, or very hard at least. But online, you probably have some forums where you have pregnant women, or forums where you have people struggling with drug addiction, and through those forums you can actually find ways to contact these participants. So the only real advantage of paper and pencil studies is that you can control the study setting. You can be sure who is participating and where they are filling out your questionnaire. So a little bit of practical tips and suggestions. Now we know that online studies are not worse than traditional research formats and are even better. The only exception is a situation when people complete your survey for payment. You may have heard about a service which is called Amazon mTurk, where people complete all kinds of tasks online for small payments. And if you're conducting your study on mTurk, you might be confident that a fairly large proportion of people, maybe sometimes up to 20%, will be motivated just to click through your questionnaire and complete it as quickly as possible to get the dollar that they get for their participation and move on to other tasks. So in this situation, you need to be very careful about your data, and you need to maybe sometimes build in some protection against this kind of approach. How do you go about practically if you want to do an online study? There are now a lot of different sources, commercial websites, and free resources where you can create an online questionnaire. SurveyMonkey is probably the most often used one, or at least it used to be. Unfortunately, it costs some money, but if you have friends at our sociology department, they have a SurveyMonkey subscription that they can share, or maybe at the lab there is a SurveyMonkey subscription. It doesn't cost really much if you do it for many people. So it's a fairly good resource. There is also Qualtrics used by American universities. Unfortunately, it costs too much for us to use. I normally use in my own research 1ka.si, a Slovenian service created by psychologists and for psychologists, which used to be free until this summer. Unfortunately, they switched to a semi-commercial approach, so now it's only free to conduct a fairly basic questionnaire, but the cost is also not really high. You can pay something like 10 euro for a month, collect your data, and that's it. If you want to do it completely free, you can use Google Docs. Google Docs makes it very easy to create a questionnaire. You just go on Google Drive, you say create new form, and you can see on these screenshots how it's done. You say create form, then you choose your title and the theme, then you give a name to your questionnaire, and you just add each question, and you tell what spreadsheet are you going to store the results in, and as a result you get a link which you can share with people either through social networks or online. The advantage is that it's extremely easy. The disadvantage is that if your questionnaire is very long, if you have like 100 questions, it will take a lot of time to create this questionnaire, because each question you will need to enter one by one. And also on Google Docs, you are not able to do random assignment of participants to groups, or a random shuffling of questions in a questionnaire. Sometimes it is important. So if you want this advanced functionality, you can use 1ka.si or SurveyMonkey or some other service. Of course, there are many more possibilities for studies that you can do online. You can randomly present people with some kind of stimuli that might be generated on the fly. Or you can select questions from a very large pool of questions randomly, or based on previous answers, and this will be adaptive testing. Or you can record mouse movements or reaction times to each item, or you can record whether a person switches to a different window or changes their answer several times. Or you can even limit the time that people take to conduct a test. For example, an IQ test usually requires this time limit. You can use all kinds of multimedia stimuli, and you can use interactive interfaces, like even a game, which can be diagnostic. And you can use automated feedback to motivate respondents, some feedback on their scores that appears on the screen and that they can paste to some social networks. So all these additional possibilities exist, but they require usually some programming or some searching for additional tools. But there are also tools to conduct experimental studies, to monitor reaction times, and to show items on the screen for very short time intervals, which you can adjust. So the possibilities for online studies are not limited to classical surveys where you get just a bunch of questions. A little bit about practical questions. How and where do you recruit your participants? Obviously, you can go on social networks and just post on your Facebook page. But then the population will be comprised, your sample will be comprised mainly by your friends and their friends' friends. And it may be a little bit different from your random sample. If you would like to get a more representative sample, you might go to some thematic forums or groups. For example, some groups like Students of Moscow. Obviously, it's a bit hard sometimes to publish there because moderators don't always allow this kind of advertisements. But if they allow, you can get a better, more representative sample. And also, if you want to get a representative sample, you can use paid human intelligence. Services like Amazon MTurk or Workzilla or Yandex Toloka in Russia are services where you can pay people a very small fee for completing a questionnaire. Right now, in American journals, there is a lot of discussion about ethics, though. If you are doing a study on mTurk, it used to be a common practice that people would do studies on mTurk and they would only pay like $1 or $2 for a very large questionnaire, which would take half an hour or an hour. And obviously, this payment was kind of not enough to compensate for the time that people spent completing this questionnaire. As a result, right now, there is this requirement that on mTurk, the payment should be fair. If your questionnaire takes an hour, people need to get at least a minimum wage for an hour, which in the States is like $7, and in some states it's even 11. And also, you need to be very careful. If your questionnaire is long, people might actually click through it. So on mTurk, it's fine to conduct very short studies, which take maybe 5 minutes. But if it takes an hour, maybe it's not the best place to do it. And of course, some universities have student pools. At the Higher School of Economics, we also have opportunities to get students from other departments involved in our studies through the minor, and just ask your supervisor about this possibility. What kind of potential issues can we encounter when we complete online studies? First, people might not be engaged in your studies. They might close the window, drop out, or give you rubbish answers. This happens when your study is very long. The only solution is to give people true information about how much time and effort will be required before they start your study. So in your informed consent form, you mention the number of items and the number of time it will take to complete all those items. And also, if you want to improve compliance, if you have some kind of demanding tasks, you may actually split them into stages. For example, you ask people to view a video and then answer some questions. But if the link to the video and the questions are given on the same page, people will be tempted to just answer the questions straight away, or to start answering them before they actually finish viewing the video, which is not what you want. So ideally, you just give them the link to the video on one page and you say, please do not proceed to the next page until you have finished viewing the video. Or if you give some demanding tasks like, could you please for 3 minutes meditate or dream about the future. We did it in some research. And then after such tasks, we normally either ask people to produce some outputs, like could you please summarize what you've been thinking about, or we just ask people to self-rate their compliance. How would you evaluate your immersion in this task? Did you really manage to meditate, or did you really manage to think about the future on a scale from 1 to 5? Very well, very poorly. And we can exclude people who admit that they did not really pay much attention or much effort to this task. As a result, you get better quality sample and your experimental manipulations might work better. Another problem is that people might give rubbish answers, especially if at the end they receive some feedback and they want to see what this feedback looks like, or if they receive $1 and they want to click through your questionnaire as quickly as possible. How can you deal with it? Monitor response time. Most survey systems allow you to monitor how much time it took for this person to complete this questionnaire. And you can be confident that on average, one question is about 10 seconds. But if a person takes less than 1 second per question, this is definitely some kind of rubbish answer. Some people include items that monitor attention, like can you read, but people get irritated by such trivial questions usually. Another approach is you can use psychometric indices of response quality, and you can calculate some very simple statistics to actually find out whether this person's answer profile behaves the way an average person profile does. And there are different statistics that you can use. I refer you here to Curran's article if you're interested in those. Unfortunately, there is no single solution that would be simple and universally applicable. So it's very tricky. Usually, I don't really do it. So I only implement it very rarely when it's really, really important to exclude non-genuine responses. Another potential problem is that people may not trust you, especially if you are using some kind of sensitive information, like have you ever used cocaine? And your respondent is a pregnant woman. uh, Obviously, this is very sensitive topic. Still, doing it online is better than doing it on paper and pencil. But it's best to make your study anonymous and to inform your people, your participants, that it's anonymous, inform people about confidentiality, uh, inform people about the ways the answers will be stored if there are some kind of identifiers. So you can build this trust with your informed consent form. And this is really what informed consent form is also for. And finally, some potential issues involve personal data. In Europe, there is this law which is called GDPR. In Russia, there is this law which is the law on personal data. So when you do an online study, you need to be a bit careful. If you do it in different countries, just find out what are the legal requirements there. And usually it's the research ethics committee and it's your supervisor who can advise you about this. Especially if you are doing an international study, in some countries, it's very, very important to have a research ethics committee approval before you start collecting your data. Otherwise, you might face problems later on. So these were a little bit of tips for online studies that might come in handy later on when you start working on your master's thesis. We did a little bit overview of different data collection methods. If you are interested in samples and sampling strategies, basically any textbook on research methods is equally good because they all describe pretty much the same thing. And if you are interested in specific data collection methods like observation or physiological measures or interviews and focus groups, I refer you to chapters in handbooks that present those topics in more detail. And I hope this was not too complicated with respect to statistics. If you were a little bit frightened by the normal distribution and by the mean and standard deviation and the z-scores, I totally recommend you to start reading in English maybe Angie Field's chapter on the normal distribution. In Russian, there is a nice textbook by Nasledov, Математические методы психологического исследования. So those of you Russian speakers frightened by statistics, I totally recommend to take a look at Nasledov's book. And next time we will discuss the issues of measurements, and I'll see you very, very soon. Bye-bye.